A new Gallup poll shows that labor unions have reached their highest approval rate since 1965. 71% of Americans approve of labor unions, up from 68% last year. The increase comes amid high-profile victories for labor unions at companies like Starbucks and Amazon in recent months. But even as approval for unions has increased...
Bro, labor unions have a higher approval rating. It's like triple the approval rating of like Congress, dude. That's insane. And yet, for some reason, people just simply cannot unionize.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows the union membership rate fell to 10.3% last year, about 14 million members. That's down 0.5% from 2020. Professor Sharon Block is the executive director of the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard Law School. She is with me now for more. Professor, welcome. Why do you think union membership has fallen despite the rise in approval, especially with companies that many Americans use daily or weekly?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very stark contrast that we're seeing. We now have a fairly sustained trend line of increase in support among the public for unions, and at the same time, as you said, this declining rate of membership. To me, that says that there's something very wrong with the law that protects people's right to be in a union. There's just no other explanation for why you would see this support, this desire. Many of that 71% also said that they would like to be in a union, but the law is becoming an obstacle to workers being able to make that desire into a reality.
What does falling union membership, even as you rightly point out, despite public support for unions, what does the actual falling membership mean for the economy?
Well, it means that a lot more people who are very vulnerable in this economy. And as we see, especially this coming out of the pandemic, there's a lot of sort of churn in the economy. And, we have a tight labor market now, which sort of gives workers a little bit more leverage, a little bit more ability to go to a different employer. But we also see at the same time the Fed trying to rein that strong labor market in, and workers will be back to being very vulnerable to having to accept unacceptable conditions in their employment. And I think that's why you're seeing this wave of organizing, like at Amazon, at Starbucks, REI, Trader Joe's, lots of different places at this moment where workers feel like they have a little bit more leverage because the unemployment rate is so low. These workers are trying to translate that moment of leverage into something more lasting so that they can be sure, as this uncertain time in the economy sort of settles, that it doesn't settle in a place that says, oh, workers, you have to get paid less, you have to accept less conditions so that we can get through whatever this period that the Fed has said will be painful.
Professor Sharon Block, we hope to continue the conversation another day. In the meantime, thank you for today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Deirdre.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking.
All right. Now we pour one out for the counter-revolutionary that played a role in perhaps one of the greater catastrophes of contemporary history, the dissolution of the USSR. Gorbachev.
The world is remembering the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, died at the age of 91. He will be remembered for helping try to end the Cold War and introduce reforms that ultimately led to the breakup of his country, the Soviet state. Liz Palmer, who was a CBS News correspondent in Moscow and interviewed Gorbachev, looks back now at his place in history.
Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev set out to reform the Soviet Union, and he ended up changing the world.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In the end, the East Germans tore down the wall for themselves, but Gorbachev didn't stop them. And that was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Born into a farming family in the Soviet Union in 1931, Gorbachev went to Moscow to study law and joined the Communist Party. In the 1980s, as the youngest ever Secretary General of the party, he set out to reform an inflexible, inefficient Soviet system. He engaged with the U.S. and in 1987 signed a momentous nuclear reduction treaty.
Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is dovyai no provyai, trust but verify.
In 1990, Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize, but his economic reforms weren't working, and Soviet citizens were going hungry and getting angry. In 1991, hardliners organized a coup against him. Gorbachev did survive, but the Soviet Union didn't, and he had to watch its collapse from the sidelines. 20 years ago, as the Moscow correspondent, I interviewed Gorbachev. Still the optimist, thinking Putin and the U.S. could be constructive partners.
The age of empires is in the past. Both sides won the Cold War because we ended it.
And I've been thinking this.
Totally. How beneficial and fortuitous that was for the Russian people.
What made you able to turn a place that didn't have freedom into freedom? What did it to you?
Well, life changed us. Efforts, attempts to reform the country, to reform our society, were made several times after Stalin's death, because what we inherited after Stalin, a totalitarian regime, repressions, the domination of one party, of one ideology, the suppression of freedom, that did not give our society, our country, enough fresh air, and therefore the country was suffocating and it needed second wind. And therefore every people who were concerned about our country tried to do something. They wanted to try some reforms. Khrushchev tried it, Kosygin tried an economic reform, but all of those were defeated because the nomenclatura always acted in a way to prevent reforms from succeeding. So we had to give a lot of thought to how we safeguard reforms. Initially it was some unhappiness, but then it became real.
And then they told me, you put cheese inside the crust. And said, you can't out-pizza the Hut. And I said to myself, maybe you are right. I will give this a try. I have never seen in all my years cheese inside the crust. Only cheese on top, not inside.
Together, just like you and I today, at a small table, and President Reagan began to accuse me, of human rights violations. He said, you have no democracy. He said, you need to make these changes in foreign policies and these changes, etc., etc. And my answer when our dialogue began to go that way was, Mr. President, you are not a prosecutor and I'm not an accused. Let us not lecture each other. We represent big countries. Let us speak as equals. I think that then we will be able to find.
I mean, even if you don't, even if you don't know anything, the immediate red flag should be that, I mean, he was handed a awful predicament regardless, if I'm going to be as charitable as possible. And his actions, some may say, would have happened regardless, no matter what, caused, as Dave Legg, third end, or Dave Legend is correctly pointing out, caused millions of deaths of despair, child prostitution, hunger, deprivation. Russia's GDP dropped by 40%, real wages halved, poverty ballooned from 2.2 million in 1987 and 88 to 66 million in 1993 to 95. Millions died under the brutal regime of privatization and shock therapy. 500,000 women were trafficked into sexual slavery. Does Gorbachev hold sole responsibility? Of course not. It was just a feeble culmination of a revisionist current in Soviet governance that made increasing accommodation to capitalist interests, but he presided over the final capitulation and that is his weight to bear. Does Gorbachev bear the primary responsibility? No. Since the 1950s, the USSR faced a vicious adversary whose policy was to enormously increase the strains on Soviet governance to promote tendencies which must eventually find their outlet in the breakup of Soviet power. For a nation that had not known a moment of peace in its short existence, that was passed like a hockey puck from Wilhelmian Germany to the Entente powers, Nazi Germany to the U.S., there could be no space for the kind of naive concessions that Gorbachev made to the West. Yes.